Have you ever lost your voice? I'm not talking about laryngitis here or the after effects of a particularly raucous karaoke night. I'm talking about that shrinking feeling when you lose all sense of who you are, your confidence, your way in the world. Well, I have, my friend. I think it's been a cocktail of a few things over the years. An exhausting, but not exhaustive combo of the shifting sands of identity, early motherhood, the ravaging of the beast that is perimenopause, social anxiety, masking, burnout, and let's not even mention the pandemic. I have become obsessed with this whole idea of finding your voice and what it means creatively, personally, and collectively when we find it. I want to understand how you find it, and if you've lost it, how do you get it back? Join me as I talk to fascinating people who have found their voices and aren't afraid to use them. People who have found their purpose, their passion, and fearless, authentic expression. I'm talking about writers, activists, artists, thinkers, entrepreneurs. We're going to get into their work and their life stories. How did they do it? What were the turning points? What barriers did they overcome? How did they find the courage? And what tips and tricks do they have to navigate this business of becoming? I'm looking to reclaim my voice, yes, and to get my mojo back, but it's more than that. I want to understand this topic and look at it from all angles: historical, cultural, societal, biological, mythical, even mystical. And most of all, through a female lens. Let's not beat about the bush, it's mostly women I'll be speaking to, with the occasional brilliant man thrown in. But these conversations are for anyone who resonates with the quest. Everybody's welcome. Hi, my name is Jessie. I'm a writer by trade, a novelist by aspiration. I do not have the answers, not yet. I'm not a certified coach with patented life theories or a high-flying CEO with productivity hacks. I am no guru, but what I am is endlessly curious about other people and their stories. I've programmed and run a literary and storytelling event series for over a decade now, so I know firsthand the power that stories have to inspire and transform, and that's what we're here for. So, if you want to find your voice or to be inspired, if you're in a liminal state, a similar boat, if you just really like books or want to feast on the sweeping stories of amazing people's life and work, then this podcast might be for you. Please follow, subscribe, and join me on this voyage into voice. And maybe, just maybe, we'll find ours along the way. Hello, and welcome to How You Find Your Voice. In this episode, I'm joined by the extraordinary poet, playwright, and best-selling author Nikita Gill to talk about her powerful book, Hekate. Written in verse, Hekate retells the story of the Greek goddess as a child of war and exile, born on the losing side of history, and follows her journey through the underworld as she grows into her purpose as the goddess of crossroads, magic, and liminal spaces. It's a coming-of-age story rooted in displacement, survival, and transformation. We talk about mythology, war, female rage, and justice, and why Hekate and what she represents feels so urgently needed now, especially for survivors and those whose voices have been silenced. We do cover some sensitive topics, including sexual abuse, so please do take care when listening if that could be a trigger for you. I was particularly excited to speak to Nikita because I've long admired her work. The themes she explores, liminality, mythology, becoming, and finding agency sit right at the heart of this podcast. I began by asking her what the response to her book has been so far. So you're here today to talk to us about finding your voice, but also your amazing new book, Hekate. Absolutely loved it. How has the reception been?
So it came out on 16th of September. And it'll be 2 months on the 16th of November. Yeah. It's been really good. I always look at this book specifically as like a word of mouth book. So I think readers will hand it to other readers. And that's what's been happening. I think when you're an author, when you've written a story that, someone will go to and go, oh my God, I really need you to read this. Because I think this will help you. And that's what I was hoping for with this book. And I think that's exactly what I've got. The amount of people who come to me and said, my mom got this for me, or my cousin got this for me, or my sister gave it to me, and it really did help. So yeah, I think that's in my view, I think all authors measure success in different ways. And for me, it's very much like three generations of a family reading my book. So a grandmother, a daughter, and the granddaughter reading my book and bringing their books to be signed by me. That's how I knew this was happening a while ago. So stuff like that. That's my measure of success for me is like, wow.
I love that. That's your barometer, kind of, yeah, word of mouth, and sort of
Yeah.
intergenerational reading rather than, I don't know, kind of hitting a number sort of book sales.
Yes. Yeah.
So it might be
Yeah.
good to give a little bit of context about what Hekate is about. I absolutely love the book. It starts with Hekate and her mother, the goddess Asteria, fleeing after the end of the very hard word to say, Titanomachy. Titanomachy. Quite a mouthful, isn't it? So Hekate and Asteria, they're on the side of the Titans, and the Titans have just lost. So
Correct.
they are essentially refugees. They're being pursued by powerful gods, and the only place they can go is into the underworld. So without giving too much
Yes.
away, Hekate kind of grows up amongst the shades and the gods of the underworld, and the whole book is really about her stepping into her power and finding her purpose. Could you tell us who exactly is Hekate and what drew you to her initially?
So, Hekate is the goddess of the crossroads, the keys, um, liminal spaces, necromancy, and I'm going to say this tentatively, witchcraft, because actually she's the goddess of magic, and the word witchcraft is quite a new word. So when we say she's the goddess of witchcraft, we say that she's the first witch. She kind of works in that space, basically, of what we consider witchcraft, which is the occult and these liminal spaces, and with spells, with herbs. With she's like the first character in Greek mythology, or one of the oldest gods who works with those things. She's what I think Madeline Miller says about Circe, a pharmacist, which loosely translated really means healer. And back in the day, prior to the many witch trials which have happened all over the world, witches weren't witches. We were healers. We were wise women. We weren't those things. We were other things, right? We were cunning folk. I think to some degree, there are lots of people who see the word witch as something that was given to us by the persecutor. So just to honor them, I always use it when I call her the goddess of witchcraft or the witch. I tend to be a little bit more, we're taking ownership back of that word. And also, it is a good way to describe what she is beyond her goddesshood, because she's very unusual that way. Not all the goddesses were witches. There were only a few that were, Hecate, you have Circe, you've got, Pasiphae. So you've got like a few goddesses that did work in that space, but it wasn't all of them. And what I find very interesting about witchcraft, so to speak, is that it did scare the patriarchy of the gods. It scared the male gods, especially, who were used to having their power and then distributing power to everyone else under them. So Hecate is very unusual that way because she's also the goddess of three worlds. She gets to walk through the underworld, which most gods don't get to do that. They don't get to walk through the underworld, through the waters, as well as through the earth and through the skies. You don't get to have all the realms that way.
Why is she allowed to do that?
Her story is interesting, isn't it? Because her mother is the goddess of falling stars and night oracles. So she's technically a goddess of like the skies, if you look at it that way, because she's a goddess of falling stars. Her father's the god of destruction, so he's an earth god. So she gets those blessings from her parents that way anyway. And then she's a goddess of the underworld because that is where she, as a child, at least in my story, that is where she goes and that is where she grows up. So she becomes a child of the underworld as well. Out of these three realms, the underworld is the one that is the most contentious because living gods have to take permission to go there. That's why there's so many stories about heroes like Heracles and like Orpheus having to cross through so much strife to get into the underworld because it is not a place for the living. And that includes immortal gods. And Hecate, at the very beginning of the book, Hades and Styx very much say this, to Asteria that if you're a goddess of the living, you are not welcome here. You're not supposed to be here. It's not a place for you or your godlings. And she's told this repeatedly, which leads her to make the terrible decision that so many mothers in situations like this have to make, which is, either I take my child with me and we both risk death, or I give my child to some form of safety. And Asteria, of course, like many mothers, chooses to protect her child over herself.
Yeah, that was so moving, that part of it. I mean, you can't not read this book and think about everything that's happening in the world at the moment, the absolute horrors and atrocities happening in Gaza, the various other conflicts. Was that part of what drew you to this story? Is it the kind of resonance with today, or does the theme of war have a kind of wider resonance for you?
I think, like, for me, I have a family history with partition from my grandfather, who, I was very, very close to before he passed away in May. But
I'm so sorry.
he was my storyteller voice. I'm very lucky that I had him for so long. He was 96 when he left us, but he gave me all of my history and my politics. And one of the things that he taught me was displacement, sadly, is an ancient story. And he also taught me that, like, the greatest tragedy, I think, for us as human beings, and the greatest failing for us as human beings, is that in 2025, we've not been able to eradicate this ancient story of displacement, and that it continues. So because his values were so strong on this, he also taught me the history behind those values. And the history was partition, where India and Pakistan became two countries from one. And he is Kashmiri, which means that he lived in a place called Srinagar, which is ground zero for where a lot of the violence of partition was. There was a complicated history there as well, because Kashmir was ruled at the time by a king who, instead of working alongside the new system which was being put into place with partition, the king ran away.
Wow.
He abandoned that area completely, which led to more violence than would have been in any other area or province, which was impacted by partition as well. And he and his family, they really went through it. And my grandfather was incredibly brave. He gave up his seat in the car to someone who needed it, who was a young girl. I find it really sad that this history of the world isn't taken into account. And this is what I wanted to show with Hekate as well, that what happens to the women who are A, at the losing end of a war, or B, in a conflict zone. And we're seeing it right now in Sudan and Congo. We saw it in Gaza. What happens to the women is particularly brutal because they get kidnapped. Pregnant women suffer the most. We really saw this 50,000 women in Gaza who had to give birth without any kind of medical assistance or facility. I really wanted to show this in this story, that because displacement is such an ancient story, what happens to the women and the children who are on the losing end of this war? People don't often think about it because it's such a shameful part of our history that it's very much eradicated from the pages. And history has a habit of being very clinical, which is why it is my job as a poet to create those monuments to moments. I always say this, but poets are the emotional historians of humankind. It is our job to make you care for people, even someone who may have existed 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago. We want you to see their emotions, the history of their heart.
Yes, and these kind of mythic frameworks, these kind of the emotional truths, as you say, they are so relevant today. And you do such a good job of it, I have to say, in Hekate. I thought it was really interesting and really clever that you focus on the kind of other side of the Titanomachy as well, because the winners write history, don't they? And I guess you could say that the gods of Olympus wrote the mythology in a sense, because most of my familiarity is with the Olympians, and I think the Titans represent maybe something kind of wilder, kind of earlier. And I thought that was a really interesting choice. Were you drawn to Hekate first, or did you want to kind of give voice to the other side as well?
I was actually thinking about it over the course of this phone call, because for some reason it came back to me. But in 2019, I wrote a book called Great Goddesses. And in Great Goddesses, there is a poem called the Titanomachy, which is about 4 pages long. And it's free verse, but also it's I kind of borrowed from Euripidean structure. This book as well. I love Euripides. There's a whole story to that, but I adore Euripides. He's one of the few poets in antiquity who I look at and think, oh, you are not a misogynist. You actually seem to like women and understand them, which is great.
Yeah.
Like you're one of like, what? You're one guy and you're a bit weird and you lived in a cave and maybe that's why you were like, all people are people. But anyway, there's a really funny story about Euripides that I'll tell in a minute. But when I was writing that poem, I was like, I feel like this could be a chapbook of its own, like of at least 20 pages, 30 pages. And I wrote it, but like every time I wrote it, it came out as a play, the story of the Titanomachy. And I realized what I did in the Titanomachy poem was I only told the Olympian perspective about how much they regretted doing what they were doing. And I was like, well, that's, I'm falling into the trap of telling it from the victor's side again. But I'm far more interested in the idea of how do you imprison an immortal? That was the question I asked myself. How do you turn an immortal god into a prisoner of war? What happens to that god? And when you start down that rabbit hole of questions, you start asking other questions. And then you start examining the gods that existed at the time of the Olympians who were on the other side. And you start realizing they're so interesting. Hekate's father, especially, really reminds me of Shiva, the Hindu destroyer god, who is one of our big three, the Holy Triumvirate, the Holy Trinity. Because Perseus is a god of destruction. And I'm like, who would you want leading your armies if you were Titans against these new gods other than the god of destruction? So I made him the leader because it made most sense. So I think like for writers, especially poets, everything begins with a series of questions. I don't think it's our job to answer every question, but it's our job to get as close as possible, or maybe even form even more questions from what we've been asking, where the genesis was. So yeah, that's where it started for me, and that's what I wanted to do. So the Titanomachy does exist as like a 20-page play. I've never finished it.
So you took that as source material, is that right? And also kind of used your imagination, your great imagination as well.
Yes.
Yeah, I was interested, like reading Hekate. I wanted to ask you about how you made those decisions of where to innovate and what to keep in. And I was also, just to add to it, like really surprised actually, because I don't want to give too much away, but let's just say that Persephone and Demeter, they do make an appearance. And I was really interested because actually, if you look, I think, is it from the Homeric hymn to Demeter, like Hekate is there. And I actually, that was an innovation, but doesn't that just go to show how kind of sidelined and how little a voice that she has had in the mythic sort of literature? I thought that was really interesting.
So I had a lot of help, I think, because for me, it was really important not just to see Hekate from the classics perspective, but also a lot of modern day witches, a lot of neo-pagans worship her. So it was really important to me to talk to them and interview them and have conversations with them as well and see what their perspectives of this goddess that they have chosen to worship is, and I wanted that version of her.
That's fascinating that you also took their sort of opinions and I guess, well, if they're worshipping her, their kind of religious, spiritual feeling for. What did you discover?
So what was really fascinating about the story, and I think this is where the genesis of Hekate as the figure that she is came for me, because again, like I told you, writers begin so many of our stories because we have questions and we haven't seen those questions answered, so we try to answer them ourselves, or we just ask more questions. Like that's what we do. But I have beef with Hesiod. I'll be very honest with you. I have major beef with Hesiod. So Hesiod obviously wrote the Theogony, which was this very short poem. He was the insta-poet, I would say, of the Greeks, because he wrote this very short poem and he was good at brevity, but he hated women, which was not unusual for, I think, a lot of the classics poets at the time, other than my darling Euripides, who tended to be a little bit fairer. And he also hated brothers, which is very odd. Like, he really didn't like brothers. And I always think that that's probably because maybe his brother ran away with his wife, which is where, like, soap opera climb that came from. I mean, Freud would have a field day with that guy's brain, I imagine. I absolutely love theogony because I think that there's so much said in so little. Like, he does the entire history of the gods. But I don't like the way that Hesiod talked about women, especially. I also don't like how he talks about Thanatos and Hypnos, who are Nyx's sons, the god of peaceful death and the god of dreams. I don't like how he talks about them because he calls them quite mean little gods, which is why I'm like, this is definitely because they're brothers and you don't like brothers. Like, he's just very odd about it.
Maybe he was an only child.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and when I was talking to all these neo-pagan witches, and the conversations that I was having with a lot of people who worship Hekate, she is the goddess. She's a very Saturnian goddess that way because the planet Saturn, is the planet of the unhoused, is the planet of the vulnerable, is the planet of the broken. So is the goddess Hekate. When I was talking to all of these amazing people who worship her, they all said that she found us. We found her symbols coming to us, and she found us first. And that's when things got really, really unusual, because when they started describing her symbols to me, I was like, oh, wait a minute. I was literally wearing one of the symbols when they spoke.
What was it?
I've got a necklace which has 3 of her gemstones in it. And it was given to me 15 years ago. Or 16 years ago, long before my own journey with mythology or Hekate in this way. And they all looked at me and they were like, that's interesting. Have you been like visited by these kind of dreams, this, that, and the other? And I was like, okay, I really do need to write this book then, because clearly,
Wow.
clearly there's like something going on here. Clearly I over-identify with her in a series of ways for other reasons as well, because I'm surrounded by her symbols.
Can I just ask, what kind of dreams were you having?
Oh, I've always had really vivid dreams. Like, this is where, like, I'm going to sound a little bit woo. I do a lot of astrology. I have Neptune in my 12th house. And people with Neptune in their 12th house, we have very vivid dreams anyway. And also, like, on a more scientific side, I have a lot of trauma in my past. And when you have a lot of trauma in your past, they translate into nightmares, night terrors, vivid dreams. You know, the brain responds to trauma in such interesting ways that these things happen. So I now, when I have these quite vivid dreams, luckily for me, they don't come to me in form of night terrors or anything like that. But the hound, which is Hekate's symbol, is in most of my dreams. And it's funny because I'm a cat person. The owl is also one of Hekate's symbols because, again, it's a nocturnal creature. Liminal spaces and nocturnal creatures are her creatures, basically. There was other things like, for instance, you know, I know a lot of people associate Hekate with the moon. The moon is Artemis and Selene's domain. But because she is a goddess that, like her, for instance, the dark noon, the Depnon, which is like the feast of Hekate, basically, which is done at night, where she raises all of the dead, you know. And this is an incredible image, if you can imagine it, of her raising all of the dead, and they go on like a gallivant across the earth amongst the living. And you're supposed to leave offerings for them on the night of the dark moon so that your house is protected from any evil. Also, you end up being protected by the dead if you leave offerings for them. This aspect of it this is why I went and talked to all the neo-pagans and like the people who worship her, because they told me all of these really interesting stories about her. But the thing which I took away was she's a goddess of the vulnerable. She appears to women who have been through assault or abuse, very much like the goddess Kali, who in Hindu mythology is the goddess of destruction and time. I could talk about this forever, by the way, so you're going to have to tell me to shut up eventually.
No, I love it.
But I don't think I would have discovered all of this in just the source material. I think because, like you said, her voice is quite small and we have so little of her in the source material. I think it was urgent for me to talk to people who actually worshipped her, who actually work with her, who are in that space, in that communion with her in a very different way, in a spiritual way. And that informed so much of this book. It really did. It bridges so many gaps. Predominantly, the reason I brought up Hesiod is that she is the only goddess, I think, in the entire book where he He does the most incredible write-up on her. It's a page and a half, and he can't stop singing her praises. And he says that she betrayed her entire family and stood with the Olympians, including her mother. And I was like, for a goddess who all of these amazing, pagans and Hekate worshippers are telling me about, who she's a goddess of the vulnerable, appears to women who've been sexually assaulted, appears to people who are unhoused. She looks after the broken in the world. Why would she abandon her mother to becoming a bed slave of these gods? Why would she do? She wouldn't do that. Not in my head, not the version of the story, not the version that I have heard from all of these people. She just wouldn't do that. So in many ways, I just disagreed with Hesiod.
Fair enough.
I just disagreed with him.
So it sounds like it's an urgent time for this story to be told, that Hekate's almost kind of coming through to you. And I love the kind of that mix between the ancient and the modern. The fact that she's having a revival in this book seems to be part of that. There's so many interesting things there that kind of I want to unpack. It's really interesting that you said that she is kind of associated with Saturn, because Saturn, from my understanding, is kind of associated with kind of limits and boundaries and stuff. And of course, she's free to roam and she's kind of boundaryless in a way. How do you think that works in terms of her mythology?
So when I referred to as a Saturnian goddess, I've never heard anyone else call her this. Like you said, Saturn is the planet of boundaries. He very much is. When I say she's Saturnian, I mean that she's a goddess of karma.
Yeah.
As well. Very much like Saturn is the planet of karma. And also, Saturn's people are the unhoused. People always say that if in India, especially where astrology and believing in astrology is quite strong, if you want Saturn to be kinder to you and he's your ruling planet, or you have negative aspects or difficult aspects with him, go and look after people, do charitable work. Those are his people. If you serve his people, you are serving him. That is the way to give offerings to him. Hekate is the same. If you serve the broken in the world, if you're basically one of her people. I don't think that the goddess Hekate, like other goddesses, had a lot of priestesses. I don't think she had a lot of priests. I don't think she had that, because she's such a boundaryless goddess in many ways. Again, very much treated people very equally, and broken people were her people. So very much like the god Saturn. That's why I got that similarity from.
That makes a lot of sense, yeah. So much of your work lives in this kind of liminal area, and Hekate is kind of a liminal goddess. You write for and about adolescence quite a lot, about becoming, about the kind of, the chrysalis moments in life. What is it that draws you or inspires you about these kind of liminal areas?
I think because, again, Saturn was my ruling planet, which means boundaries were drawn for me almost. And I had a very kind of, I would say, a strict upbringing. I think it's just because I lived in India, I lived in New Delhi, which can be quite a dangerous place for young women. So there were these boundaries, quite harsh and hard boundaries that were in my life from a really early age. And then I came here. I came to the UK. I did my master's for a year over here. And the first night that I was over here, this is going to sound wild, but the thing which I did was I went and I stood outside my student accommodation at 2 a.m. I just looked at the sky, this dark sky at the time. The stars were nearly completely gone. And I had never experienced that. I had had so many boundaries in my life that I had never had the experience of looking up at the night sky outside at 2 a.m. on a patch of grass. And that was the thing that really made me interested in the boundaries that we draw around ourselves, around each other, where they come from, whether they come from safety, whether they come from, a government drawn boundary, what we have around countries. I find boundaries fascinating things. And questioning them has become so routine for me, because 16 years ago, I had this experience of, I've never done this. I'm in my 20s and I have never done this. It was summer, the breeze on my face. How strange that I have been denied this experience because of boundaries that have been set up for me to keep me safe.
The feeling of freedom. What effect did that have on you then, that moment? How did that then sort of play out? in your life?
I think my quest to be a liberated woman, that was one of the core memories, I would say, that bolstered that quest. I've always been really fiercely independent. Again, that came from trauma in my childhood. And I think when you have go through trauma when you're quite young, it makes you fiercely independent because you feel like you don't have anyone that you can depend on. I will never take like my freedoms for granted. Like, and it's the reason why I fight so hard in my work, in like, on publicly, I fight so hard for people to have their freedoms, because I think true freedom is everyone having equal rights, but women specifically, our bodily autonomy is politicized constantly. Not just women, just people with wombs. Like our existence is consistently politicized because we have wombs. And I just think the capacity of someone else, and I always look at these photographs of like rooms full of men signing legislation, and there's not a single person like in that room that has a uterus. They're signing legislation against us, against our bodily autonomy. And that's one of the things that really upsets me and makes me angry about this world, because I think when you have lived in existence where you can see the world that way, when you can see it very clearly, like this is not fair, this is not justice. And again, I had this amazing grandfather who like essentially gave me this really strong sense of justice.
At this point, we were interrupted by hissing sounds, which we naturally attributed to tech gremlins, and we got a little sidetracked by fairy folklore. Once it was sorted, we picked up where we left off.
About the kind of understandable anger that you feel about the kind of oppression, essentially, in terms of legislation, bodily, kind of the patriarchy weighing down on us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And again, like all of my work sort of addresses that in many ways. But my stories about the goddesses, they have a version of patriarchy. Despite being these incredibly powerful goddesses, the patriarchy of the gods is very interesting because it also is a rigid, patriarchal structure. There's a god king who's right on top, usually quite paranoid about his power. We see it in Zeus. We definitely see it in Kronos. We see it in Uranus. So 3 generations of that family of like god kings are all very paranoid that someone is going to come and take their power. Usually the people they're most paranoid about are their own children.
Always their sons, always prophesized.
Always their sons. Always their sons. Although I would always say out of all of Zeus's children, I think Athena would have been the one who would have overthrown him, because the story is that Metis would give birth to a child and that's why he devours her. As a fly.
Yeah, it's like I mentioned a soap opera before, but it's just like, it's incredible. I mean, the incest, but just I suppose the timelines are so big as well, which is I never really thought about it. I think you do such a good job of like showing the sort of a goddess coming into herself, but also the different timelines for kind of gods and mortals. So if you think about the end of the Titanomachy to where we are at the end of the book, I mean, like thousands and thousands of years are going by, but Hekate is just sort of, she's just coming through adolescence or something. I found that really, I found that really interesting.
Someone was asking me, they're like, okay, but like the book's timeline is very interesting because it doesn't seem to fit. And I'm like, why do you think the gods correspond to a linear idea of time? Because mortals have to respond to that because we age. The gods don't age. No. Why would they respond to linearity of time?
But they do change in your book, which I think is really interesting, because I think we think of gods and goddesses as sort of kind of like these, they're set in stone. They have their powers. They have the things that are associated. But I thought it was really interesting how you approach Hades in the book, because it's very 3-dimensional, and we see kind of how he is with Hekate kind of at the beginning, and then how he changes as he kind of grows into his role, and also just the idea of kind of goddesses and gods kind of stepping into their power. I thought that was a really interesting device. Why did you decide to do that?
It is a coming of age story, but I also don't think anything or anyone is born perfect and then just sticks to that personality from birth, right? Like we know that the gods are born and then they change, because that's what all living things do. And the gods are very much living beings, and they are also changed by the experiences that happen to them. you know, I find Hades a very fascinating character. I always find it very interesting that people say, "Oh, he is the best," because they have reconfigured the Hades Persephone story into a love story, right? There are a lot of modern iterations of the story that it's a love story, right? Like it's a, you know, kind of like a May December romance is what someone once described it to me as, and I see Hades through a very critical eye. Yeah.
A May December romance. Not much agency, but just kind of trapped.
One of the people who I've seen do the story in a really entertaining, in a really brilliant way is B. Fitzgerald, who's done Girl, Goddess, Queen. And I think she gives, but Persephone a lot of agency, even though there's the romance angle there. So there are ways to do it without it being super problematic. But I think a lot of people, and I would say myself included in Great Goddesses, I didn't acknowledge that aspect of it at all. I was like, he's her uncle on both sides. When I went and revisited that poem, or those two poems I wrote about, I'm like, he's her uncle on both sides, man. It is creepy. It is creepy no matter how you look at it. The ick. It is the ick. So I couldn't get rid of the ick. And I was like, you know what? I want to tell the story of Persephone being the ultimate survivor. Because she is the ultimate survivor. She leaves her own name behind. She was Kore, goddess of spring. She becomes Persephone, queen of hell, or queen of Hades, right? And queen of the underworld, I wanted to show her, because without showing that part of the story where Hades changes, it is incredibly hard to show the version of the story where Kore becomes Persephone. And I think that survivors deserve that story. I think women who have been through assault or abuse or, false imprisonment at the hands of a powerful man deserve that story. That's why I wanted to write that version of the story. And the only way to write that version of the story was to show Hades in all of his ugliness and his terror and his beauty. I wanted people to see him for all of that. But at the same time, I did want to show them that, Hades, out of the three brothers, was probably the least problematic. Like, I would see him more as like the most antisocial, kind of spent too much time by himself. You like the pretty girl, just ask her out for a coffee. Don't kidnap her and drag her to the underworld. Like,
it seems unnecessary.
Didn't want to give her the opportunity to say no, which is, again, like, please, man.
And the interesting thing is that Hekate is there. She's there in the original myth. And then she, in the tradition, she becomes her sort of protector, which really fits in with everything you say about how she's kind of the goddess of kind of broken things and survivors. Completely. Not the survivors of broken people, but you get what I'm saying. That was really fascinating.
In the source material, Demeter goes to, no one will tell her who has taken her child. She doesn't know who has taken her child. She goes to Helios. She goes to Zeus. No male god in power will tell her who takes her child. Hekate does. Hekate tells her. Hekate helps Persephone and helps. And I was like, isn't that a fascinating mirror to one of the few goddesses in the pantheon who doesn't have her mother?
Yes.
What motivates her?
Well, it's kind of healing. I thought that, like, kind of reading the book, it's kind of like almost, in so doing that, then she kind of finds her own sort of, I don't want to say too much, but, I guess it heals a wound in her, doesn't it?
Completely. And also, there's so much of, this book very much is about, her trying to find her purpose.
Yes.
And, sometimes the purpose is, an obvious thing, these are my powers, right? And sometimes the purpose is bigger than that, is these are my people. The wounded, the vulnerable.
When did you find your purpose? So was there a moment when you kind of felt, okay, this is what I want to do? Or was there a point when you realized, okay, I found my voice in whatever way that means to you?
I am here to hug everyone that deserves a hug and to drink the blood of my enemies. That's my purpose in my life.
That's quite like a Kali vibe.
Just saying, that's me. Here to hug everyone who deserves a hug, all the good people, and to drink the blood of my enemies. So I'm equal parts driven by kindness and spite, I would say. So those are my purposes.
I love that. You write rage in a really like brilliant way. It's kind of like a sort of a righteous anger on the behalf of kind of the of women and young girls, I think. What do you want people to understand about female rage?
Oh, that's such a big question. I think, just yesterday I was having this conversation where I was talking about how if you read, Baldwin, if you read Frantz Fanon, if you read Edward Said, they all talk about how rage is a very politicized thing because rage gets stuff done, right? And there is very much a conversation which we can have about why it is in the benefit of anyone who is oppressing you that you do not feel angry and lash out at them. So rage has been inoculated from society as a bad thing. And women who express rage at their treatment are deeply vilified. Look at the way we treat any survivor of like sexual assault. In fact, look at the way the justice system is structured, right? The onus is always on someone who has been assaulted to prove that they have been assaulted, which means in a very cruel way, that woman or that person has to repeatedly live through the story of their abuse and their assault for the police, for judges, in court, in front of their abuser, and be consistently doubted on that story. Consistently doubted, unless they can produce hard evidence, which we know in crimes of assault and abuse are incredibly hard. And then those people are expected not to be angry. They're expected not to be angry. Women especially, because we live in a culture where, the abuse of women very much is normalized. If you look at domestic abuse statistics, if you look at assault statistics, the abuse of women has been normalized. If you think about how much women have to do to protect ourselves and how hypervigilant we are about our safety, that's just the norm for us. And then we are expected to also smile through it and to not get angry and to be calm and to be saints, to be complete saints about it. I don't know whether you will be allowed to put this into the podcast or not, but I will openly say this, that I think that it is incredibly unjust that women in 2018, at great cost to ourselves, talked about our stories of abuse in 2017, 2018, when it came to the Me Too movement. And we shared these deeply traumatic and painful stories. Millions upon millions of women did this. And the end result of that was putting a sexual abuser in the White House twice. Twice. Countless of accusers who've come forward who've said that they are victims of this man. They put this guy, who openly talks in a very negative way and a horrendously misogynistic way about women, into the White House twice.
It's terrifying.
It is. And then we're expected not to be angry.
Yeah, the assaults kind of that are going on free speech and kind of journalists being hushed and things. We're like living through the Dark Ages or like the 1930s or something again, it often feels.
There's a really great saying, because again, unfortunately for myself, I'm a huge optimist. And I always say this, the old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. This is a time of monsters, right? That's the saying. But I also say that every time of monsters is a time of heroes. And, we are seeing that. We're seeing so many people step up, like, to create this new world, which is a fairer, more equal world. And I always say that we're living through the darkest time because we are moving towards a fairer time. We're moving towards the time of light. I strongly believe, I think it was Martin Luther King who said this, that the moral arc of the universe may be long, but it always bends towards justice. And I believe that we are living through these times because the old world, which was the unfair world, is the people may be being silenced, but people are being louder than ever. The situation in Gaza was terrible, but the amount of people who have become educated about it in the last 2 years, about the history of Palestine, I think is incredible. And that has happened because of social media. It has happened because of people organizing. It has happened because of grassroots movements. The victory that we just saw in New York, he was polling at 1%, Zoran Mamdani, in February. He won the election. He was the complete wild card. And he won because he refused to compromise on the rights of any marginalized group. He ran one of the most pro-LGBTQ, pro-Palestine, anti-genocide. He ran on a platform that we have been told repeatedly by people who are more center-right that you cannot run on those platforms because you have to compromise on someone's rights. Like we have people like Nigel Farage over here saying that abortion should be on the chopping block.
You're right. It kind of feels like before the dawn, it's like the darkest day kind of thing. And it'd be quite easy to think that kind of with the rise of reform and everything seems to be going definitely right of centre in some ways. But then you're right. There is the kind of grassroots movement. There is like a response and people are using their voices more, which is encouraging. There is hope. You're right. There is hope.
Yeah. Yeah. And like, so I joined the Green Party like recently. I've been like, politically, I've not been sure to join because Labour really has disappointed me. I would never join the Tories, obviously not Reform. But the Green Party, I recently joined as a member because I think what Zach Polanski is doing is amazing. He very much like Zoran Mamdani is saying, I'm not going to compromise on anyone's human rights. Like that is what we have been looking for. And they've doubled their membership in months. They've doubled their membership. So there is hope. There is hope. We just need to keep up the momentum and not get complacent. As politically active people, that is our job.
Definitely.
Right?
What advice would you give to, especially maybe young girls or kind of women who know that they have a voice and they have things to say, but they are terrified of being misconstrued or judged or criticized? You know, they feel the noise of either the patriarchy or maybe it's social media weighing down on them. What advice would you give them?
I always say this when it comes to women and girls especially. There is nothing you can do or say to appease the patriarchy. There is nothing. They will find a reason to hate you, even if you sit in the exact margins of what they want of you, which is this tiny little box. They will find a reason to hate you. There is no point in making yourself so small that you live half a life. You live half a life or quarter of a life to appease a beast that hates you anyway.
When did you learn that? And how did you learn it? Was there a moment you learned? Did you learn it the hard way?
Yeah. I learned it the hard way. I grew up in New Delhi, and there were so many boxes for young women there. Not for any other reason. It's just not very safe to be a young woman and live in New Delhi because you are a target. It's just one of those things. So I grew up with that, and I grew up with this rage, like we talked about feminine rage. I grew up with this rage that like the men that I knew did not have to live that way. They just didn't. They just got to live, right? And every woman I know and loved, and I think again, it wasn't just rage about my freedoms, is the rage against the fact that like all the women I loved, and I have loved women all of my life, they had to live in that box. And I was like, imagine how much more we would have if women were allowed to be free and were not given these boundaries and hypervigilance that they had to think about all the time. I'm especially protective of mothers. I don't think we live in a world which is friendly towards mothers. That's why so much of this book is about mothers and daughters, is because, you know, women were promised a village. And instead, we have less and less and less being given to mothers. And then the expectation is mothers keep producing more children. It enrages me. And also, like, we're living in a world which is not friendly to mothers and it's not friendly to children, whereas it should be led by mothers and children. That's it. It just, when it clicked, I think I was 7 when it clicked in my head. It's like, my mother is the head of the household. She just is. She is the head of the household. She runs the house. She looks after the kids. She nurtures the kids. That's the head of the household, in my opinion. Someone who runs the household. My mother could run a country. She's so organized. She could run a country. You're telling me that women are the heads of the household, but they can't be trusted to run countries. What? Put a bunch of mums in charge today, just, for a week, put a bunch of mums in charge, see what happens. I stand by this.
You found that out at such a young age. That's really fascinating.
I had an incredibly strong mother who was having to raise us by ourselves, not because my father and she were divorced or anything. It's just my father went out to sea to sail for 8 months at a stretch. That was his job. So she had to raise us by herself, this capital city. That was quite dangerous. So I had a really strong mum. You have a really strong mum growing up, you realize things really early on. And I'm absolutely convinced that one of the reasons why like the patriarchy really hates single mothers especially is because children get that kind of education from a single mother, you know?
That's really made me think, actually. So we're almost at the end. I wanted to ask you, if you were a goddess, which one would you be?
Do you know what's really funny is I'm writing the Hekate play and I'm actually playing Hekate in the play.
What? Are you? Where's the play going to be? When can we see it?
Yeah. It's at the British Library is the showcase. So we're doing the showcase there, which is just 45 minutes of the play, which is about an hour and a half long. And it's me and the girl who plays Demeter, and we have someone who's playing Hades. Really amazing actors. So waiting for the announcement to happen so I can like put it out onto my feeds. But yeah, I play Hekate basically. So if there's a goddess, it would be her.
Oh my God, this sounds brilliant. I would love to see it. Is it going to be a trilogy?
First of three. Yeah. Loosely connected trilogy because, like I said, I don't believe in the linearity of time.
Okay.
So each one is going to be a different goddess. So you've got 3 goddesses of the underworld. So you've got Hekate. The second one is going to be Styx. That's actually going to be announced in 2 days. So I can tell you this. So it's going to be Styx. So she's the river of the dead. And she's also the goddess of hatred. But Styx was born an Oceanid, the oldest of the nymphs. And the nymphs don't have a lot of power.
No.
And I'm very fascinated in this. They basically exist to become brides or playthings of the gods in many, many, many stories. You know, they're supposed to be the nurturers of nature, basically. I find the nymphs fascinating. I think they're really, really interesting. And I think there's like an entire like chapbook of like just nymph stories, which one day I will write. But like, Styx is the oldest of these nymphs. How does she become a goddess? And that's the story which I'm covering in this book. And also Asteria plays a really big role in this book. I love Asteria. I think she is such a fascinating goddess. So she and Styx are very close growing up. And we see what separates them, and it's war.
Back to war, which is...
Back to war. And again, the roles of women in these awful, terrible situations, and what do they do?
Yeah. Absolutely. I wanted to just maybe end with the power of stories, because the power of stories really comes across in this book. You know, it's kind of a literal guide. It's the way that Hekate kind of understands herself and her role in the universe. What do you say is the power of stories, and what restricts and what empowers when it comes to stories?
I think, you know, I look at story as a very politicized thing. And I think, like, you know, the politicians that we have who we call populists are actually just really good storytellers. They tell people exactly what they want to hear, but they make it into a story, right? Nigel Farage's entire career, I would say, is being a really good storyteller. He knows exactly how to tell people the right thing that they want to hear in that precise moment. Donald Trump, people think that he's incredibly, you know, he's a very silly man. He's a very good storyteller, because if you notice the way that he talks about his personal enemies, he manages to turn them into an enemy of America. He doesn't just say, oh, this person is my enemy and they're mean to me. No, he uses very specific words. He uses nasty, he uses traitor. He uses language in a very particular way. He's a very good storyteller. And he's able to like have a finger on the pulse of the masses because he knows what they want to hear in that time. The worst impulses. He is a storyteller of the worst impulses of those people. So if we just look at our political class and we see who has managed to really sway people and sway the masses, and you have them on both sides, right? Like you have like the terrible ones, like I would say Donald Trump and Farage, who are managing to like gin up some real problems because they're tapping into story that way. They're telling a particular kind of story. And then you have people like Polanski and Mamdani who are telling a different story, a story of hope. They're telling a story of like kindness and of hope, and like they're using language in a very specific way. So I think at the heart of it, all story is about language. And there's a poet who once said this, that if you are looking for where fascism starts, it starts in language. It starts in story, you know? And it is up to us as every single individual out in this world to hold story with the credence and the love that our ancestors held story with. Our entire species began when language began, and we began to collect around fires, and we began to tell each other's story. And we're talking centuries and millennia ago. That's where we came from. We need to go back to the heart of that. We need to go back to the fire. Remember that the fire welcomes everyone, and sit around and tell stories that welcome everyone instead of excluding X person or Z person or Y person as certain politicians do. You know, people are not enemies, not at our hearts. And I strongly believe this, and I know I've been called naive for this. I don't think human beings are greedy. I don't think human beings are naturally greedy. I think human beings are naturally self-preserving. We are self-preserving. And in the wrong hands, in the wrong leaders' hands, that self-preservation turns into fear and greed and anger. Because we are consistently made to feel like our fellow human beings are our enemies. I mean, there's only one story. Like, the universe is called the universe, which translated is one poem. There is only one story, and that story is there's only one race. There's the human race, right? We need to tap into that, and we need to understand that there's more that unifies us than separates us. Instead of like forming these little like, oh, that person over there, that person's evil. You gotta stop doing that.
Here. You are a remarkable storyteller, and long may you continue to tell the stories that bring us all together and inspire us. Thank you so much for speaking to me today. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I wish you all the best with all of your future endeavours.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We recorded this conversation back in November, and yet the themes seem even more relevant now. It really does feel like it's a time of monsters. We are being forced again and again to confront how absolute power corrupts absolutely. Since we recorded this, there have been further waves of allegations and revelations about abuse at the highest levels. It's a reminder of how often power has been used to exploit, silence, and harm. Hekate and what she represents is so needed right now. She's a figure who stands with the vulnerable, with those who have been harmed. She's the guardian of survivors. She is gentle, but she is fierce. She is feared by the gods of Olympus because she exists and operates outside of their rules. There's a great quote in the book: "A woman they cannot control, whether goddess or mortal, is a dangerous woman." Nikita seems to me to embody Hekate's energy too. No wonder she played her on stage. I loved the bit when she says that her purpose is to be kind to her friends and drink the blood of her enemies. And she does that by speaking openly, writing boldly, and refusing to shrink. I really enjoyed chatting to Nikita and found it really inspiring and uplifting in spite of what we covered. And in spite of everything, she's right. There are reasons to be hopeful. As she points out, where there are monsters, there are also heroes. When things seem very dark, when we're engulfed in the underworld or at the worst point, holding on to that hope and to optimism is a radical act in itself. Thank you for listening to this episode of How You Find Your Voice. If you enjoyed it, please share it with a friend and follow the show. Until next time.